Well, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us in this second day of the joint BMSTC-Cell press conference, Net Zero and Beyond, Pathways to Decarbonization. And welcome to the first of two panel discussions focused on how to offset residual emissions. Today, we're going to talk about nature-based solutions, and tomorrow's session will start with another exciting panel discussion on negative emission technologies. Nature-based solutions provide an opportunity to both mitigate climate change and restore and protect the world's natural capital. However, ecosystems on land and on the ocean are facing threats of severe degradation, compromising biodiversity, ecosystem services, and carbon storage potential. In this panel, we're going to talk about the mitigation potential of nature-based solutions, the co-benefits they can provide in the context of other grand social environmental challenges, and existing and potential barriers and opportunities to their implementation. My name is Abel Barral. I'm a scientific editor of Cell Press's flagship sustainability journal, One Earth. And I'm extremely pleased to have the opportunity of moderating this panel composed by Professor Catherine Lovelock, who is a professor in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Queensland and an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow. Professor Zhangcai, who is professor in the School of Atmospherical Sciences at the Sun Yat-sen University. Professor Niki Frantzeskaki, who is a chair professor of regional and metropolitan governance and planning at Utrecht University. Professor Carlos Alfredo Joly, who is emeritus professor at the University of Campinas, member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, of the IPBES Capacity Building Task Force, and coordinator of the Brazilian Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And our keynote today, Prof. Pete Smith, who is a professor of soils and global change at the University of Biological and Environmental Sciences at the University of Aberdeen, and science director of the Scottish Climate Change Centre of Expertise. He's a fellow of the Royal Society, the Royal Society of Biology, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, a fellow of the Institute of Soil Scientists, a foreign fellow of the Indian National Science Academy, and a fellow of the European Science Academy. I'll be shortly handing over to Pete for the keynote talk, and after it, the other panelists will be invited to briefly describe their background and research interests in the context of nature-based solutions, to then move on what I'm sure it will be a very interesting discussion. Please feel free to enter questions via the interface. And if we have time, we will put these to panel members. If you would like to ask a question, please do so within the first 90 minutes of the session, and ideally indicate to which panel member you would like to address your question. It is time to mute myself. I've already talked too much, and let Pete tell us about nature-based solutions. Could I please ask the other panelists to turn off their cameras and unmute themselves during the talk, please?
Thank you, Abel.
Pete, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about nature-based solutions, the potential and pitfalls. So looking at why do we need nature-based solutions? Well, firstly, if we look at our trajectory of temperature rise and greenhouse gas emissions, you can see that our business as usual trajectory, shown on the yellow line, is to continue increasing greenhouse gas emissions quite significantly, which then start to fall maybe in the second half of the century. We know that this is not tenable. To get to a temperature that is livable, we need to stay within 2 or even better 1.5 degrees Celsius. So to achieve that, we need abatement technologies. And most of these can be achieved through conventional abatement technologies shown over here in the green. So this is things like moving to renewable energy and decarbonising all sectors of society. That gets us further down towards 2 or 1.5 in terms of emissions, but it doesn't get us all the way there, because in this pink zone, we can see there are still some emitting technologies. If we're still going to continue to fly, maybe there are some emissions from aviation, and there are still residual emissions from agriculture, particularly nitrous oxide and methane, which are extremely difficult to abate. So even if we make rapid progress in conventional abatement technologies, we're probably left with some greenhouse gas emissions in the mix out beyond to 2050. So in order to negate these emissions that are still in the mix, we need some negative emissions. And there's going to be a session on negative emissions tomorrow. But one way of achieving negative emissions is to use natural climate solutions, which can absorb CO2 from the atmosphere and sequester that carbon in natural systems. So it's mainly those that I'm going to be talking about today. So we need these negative emissions, these nature-based solutions providing negative greenhouse gas emissions as a way to compensate for the residual emissions that are still in the mix after we've done all of our best efforts across all sectors of the economy. So that's why we need carbon removal technologies, and some of those can be nature-based solutions, as I'll show on the next slide. So this is from the 2017 emissions gap report of UNEP. And this is, we looked at the greenhouse gas removal options that are available. And you see that there's a range of options available. For example, on the technological side, there are things like direct air capture and ocean alkalinity enhancement and storing CO2 in durable carbon products. These are technology solutions which can be used to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. However, what I'm going to talk about today are these natural climate solutions over on the left. Things like afforestation, reforestation, use of biochar, soil carbon sequestration, and the restoration of wetlands and peatlands are just some examples of natural climate solutions, mainly in the agriculture and forestry areas, which can be used to suck up CO2 from the atmosphere and store it for the short to medium term to keep it out of the atmosphere. Now, the natural solutions tend to be less costly. They're closer to deployment, but they are more vulnerable to reversal. So they have some advantages and some disadvantages compared with technological measures to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. There's quite a large potential of natural climate solutions. This was a paper by Frantzeskaki et al. In 2017, which was really a breakthrough paper looking at the potential of natural climate solutions around the world to mitigate climate change. And you can see that these ones, the options available can be broken down into forestry options, for example, reforestation, avoided conversion, natural forest management, improved plantations, etc. Those options are available in agriculture and grassland, and those options are available in wetlands, such as coastal restoration, peatland restoration, and avoided coastal and peat impacts. When combined together, these give us quite a significant potential. So you can see potentials of single options here, technical potentials of over 10 gigatons of CO2 per year. And the cost-effective mitigation potential is also still quite significant. When added together, these can give you a potential offset of about 20 to 30% of current emissions. So whilst it's not a panacea, it's not a magic bullet for solving climate change, it can make a significant contribution. A study published just last year, Stephanie Rowe and colleagues did an assessment on a country-by-country basis, a reassessment of this natural climate solutions potential, and they found that there was a significant potential around the world, and they could break this up by countries and by regions. So the webinar is coming from China this morning. So if we look at this Asia and Developing Pacific tab, we can see that the majority of the potential is in the forest sector. So it's protecting existing forests, restoring degrading forests, and to some extent, a small amount of management. There are some demand side measures. So these are things like dietary change and waste reduction can make significant contributions. And then there are reducing emissions and sequestering carbon in the agriculture sector, which are other options available to us. We can have a look in a bit more detail. So this is again looking in the same way as I showed the Griscom et al. Figure. This breaks it down by the individual measures. So forestry options here, coastal and wetland restoration over here, and then options in the agriculture sector shown at the bottom. And shown in yellow is Asia and developing Pacific. So again, China is shown here. And we can see that there's quite a significant chunk of all these options is available in Asia and the developing Pacific. And we can break it down by country. You can see China is shown here. We're now looking at the Asian developing Pacific region specifically. And if we look at China, the largest mitigation potential, not surprisingly, is in China. There's quite a significant potential to sequester carbon in agriculture in this light pink bar here. In the dark pink is the potential to reduce methane emissions, predominantly methane emissions, but also nitrous oxide. And that's shown in this dark pink region. There's some demand side measures possible and a smaller potential, but still significant for forestry options, managing, protecting and restoring forests. So we have quite a large potential available in China, which can contribute to the global total of natural climate solutions. Further breaking it down by what we can do by enteric fermentation management, manure management, rice cultivation. Here we can see that we have quite a potential, but a larger potential to sequester carbon either in croplands, which is shown here, in grasslands, which is shown in the sort of brown area, from agroforestry, which is shown in this pink area, and biochar, which is shown in this purple area. And there are other options available, as I said, in forestry and also through demand side measures. For example, switching towards healthy diets, consuming less meat and dairy, and reducing food waste. So all of these options are natural climate solutions, or options that we can perform in the land sector, which give us the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to create carbon sinks, which offset those residual emissions. Now, I've been talking so far about natural climate solutions, but I should emphasize that not all natural climate solutions are nature-based solutions. This is because nature-based solutions have the fundamental basis in biodiversity protection. So we can do a range of these natural climate solutions, which I've talked about up until now in the talk, without enhancing biodiversity. For example, we could imagine a situation where we plant a plantation forestry of non-native species, which is not really so great for biodiversity. It will suck up carbon. It's a natural climate solution in that it's a solution that works on the land, but it is not a nature-based solution because it doesn't enhance biodiversity, and it's not necessarily implemented with the consent and full involvement of the people on the ground. So what makes a nature-based solution different from a natural climate solution is it has this idea that it will support biodiversity and also will be implemented with the full consent and collaboration of the people who are living and working in that particular area. So nature-based solutions largely can be broken down into those that protect existing high biodiversity and high carbon stocks. For those that have been degraded, there's the option of restoring those. So this is restoring them to their former glory so that they store more carbon and again provide habitats for biodiversity. We can manage land to better remove carbon, and we can create novel systems so that they also promote biodiversity and lock up carbon. If we do all of this, we can get these co-benefits. So greenhouse gas reduction, flood and erosion control, coastal defence, etc., etc. All these co-benefits fall out of nature-based solutions and ultimately can contribute towards sustainable development, human well-being, and biodiversity. So we can look at the natural climate solutions, and we can assess them in terms of if they constitute nature-based solutions. So here's an example for afforestation, reforestation. There are a range of functions provided by afforestation, reforestation, shown in this middle ring of the pizza. Things like carbon sequestration, recreation, job creation. These are the functions that are provided by the trees that we plant. If we look in the middle ring, we can see the contribution of these functions of planting trees towards nature's contributions to people. So these are the ecosystem services that have been defined by the IPBES program as the contributions that nature makes to people. And you can see shown in the small green circles is the function that contributes to this particular ecosystem service. And we can go one step further in the outer ring of the pizza. We can look at the Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are contributed to by these ecosystem services. So what's shown in these little blue circles is the ecosystem service that contributes to the Sustainable Development Goal. And you can see that reforestation contributes positively to most nature's contributions to people and Sustainable Development Goals. There are variable impacts for some of them. For example, it could compete with land that is used for food production. So it could have variable effects on SDG2, zero hunger. And it could have some negative impacts locally on economic growth. But this gives us a framework within which we can assess the contribution of a natural climate solution or a potential nature-based solution on ecosystem services and on the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not going to go into detail here for all of them, but this is just another example for soil carbon sequestration. And we can see that all of the impacts of soil carbon sequestration on ecosystem services and the Sustainable Development Goals are entirely positive. So there are some nature-based solutions which can just give entirely positive co-benefits. However, we have to be aware that nature-based solutions can be used for greenwashing. So if we're using nature-based solutions as a permit to continue emitting, that would be a bad use of nature-based solutions, and that would be an example of greenwashing. Even worse, there are some examples already of where nature-based solutions have been tied to the continued use of fossil fuels. So an example is Shell is selling something called Go Plus Petrol in the UK, which offers customers the opportunity to drive carbon neutral through the use of nature-based carbon offsets. Now, this is a really bad idea because it promotes the idea that we can continue burning fossil fuels. And we know that we can only use nature-based solutions to offset residual emissions. We can't continue burning fossil fuels at the rates that we do and then expect nature-based solutions to mop up all of that carbon. It simply is it's not a zero-sum game. There are some examples of lack of additionality where credits have been given protecting forests that never would have been deforested. So those are examples of greenwashing, where it's nature-based solutions being used inappropriately. And there's also the example of leakage. So where you create carbon sinks in one place only for the activity to be displaced elsewhere, and that causing emissions elsewhere. So we have to be very aware of the potential for greenwashing of nature-based solutions. However, if they're implemented correctly, they can provide benefits for biodiversity and for climate change mitigation. So 4 guiding principles have been proposed to make sure that nature-based solutions provide sustainable benefits to society. The first is that nature-based solutions are not a substitute for the rapid phase-out of fossil fuels. That has to be the primary aim, and we're only using nature-based solutions, if at all, to mop up those residual emissions, those really difficult to abate emissions. Nature-based solutions involve a wide range of ecosystems on the land and in the sea, not just forests. Most of the public attention has been drawn to tree planting, but there are many other options available, and we have to consider all of them, not just on the land, but also those in the oceans. They have to be implemented with the full engagement and consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities in a way that respects their cultural and ecological rights. That's very important. And lastly, they should be explicitly designed to provide measurable benefits to biodiversity. And if a natural climate solution doesn't fulfill all of these criteria, it can't be regarded as a nature-based solution. So just to conclude, the land can't do it all. There's not enough land to soak up all of the emissions from all sectors of the economy, like transport, energy generation, and aviation. We need immediate and aggressive action across all sectors of the economy if we're to meet our net zero targets. Not all land-based greenhouse gas removal options constitute nature-based solutions. As I mentioned, if they're not involving the local community and they don't provide measurable benefits to biodiversity, they cannot be regarded as nature-based solutions. Most land-based removal options can deliver benefits to ecosystem services and the UN Sustainable Development Goals if implemented appropriately. But if implemented poorly, many nature-based solutions, land-based greenhouse gas removal options could harm biodiversity, ecosystem services, and impede the delivery of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So the appropriate implementation is absolutely critical. So it's not really what you do, it's the way that you do it that determines whether it will be a successful nature-based solutions. But if implemented carefully, nature-based solutions are good for biodiversity, good for people, and good for both climate change adaptation and mitigation. Not all nature-based solutions are land-based. Just to remind you of that, there are ocean-based approaches which are comparatively under-researched, so we could do more work in assessing the potential for nature-based solutions in the ocean. And lastly, we have to be on the lookout for greenwash, because some people will use potential nature-based solutions inappropriately, and we have to be on the lookout for that and call it out where it happens. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop it there.
Thank you so much, Pete, for such an enlightening talk. I think you've provided really interesting insights into the potential of land-based, nature-based solutions for mitigation, about the potential pitfalls, and particularly on how implementation will be critical. I hope we can discuss a bit more on this implementation aspect later on. But before that, I'd like to ask the other panelists to turn their cameras on and unmute themselves. And I think it's a good timing, to give the audience a brief overview of your backgrounds around nature-based solutions, your research interests. We can, because we have this, time zone scatter panel, and we have this, this diversity from one side to another. Maybe we can use a time zone wise criterion for interventions, if that's okay with you. So, would you like to start with this, Catherine?
Sure. My name's Catherine Lovelock. I'm from the University of Queensland, and my research has focused on blue carbon. And by blue carbon, I mean the carbon that's associated with coastal wetlands, so mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass meadows. So these are ecosystems that are occupying the edge of the land where it meets the sea. And so that edge of the land should give you the hint that these are relatively limited in aerial extent, in cover of the globe, right? So, that's one thing to hold in your mind. The second is, though, that they are extremely productive and they are higher plants. So plants like the trees that you can see behind me, but they're in the marine environment. They're being flooded by tides. And that means they bring these rather difficult to decompose tissues, leaves and wood and other things into the, soils where they accumulate, right? So they're highly productive. And then because the soils are flooded, this really slows decomposition, and you have these large stocks of carbon accumulating in these ecosystems. So that means if you disturb them, you're going to lead to greenhouse gas emissions. And unfortunately, these ecosystems have been trashed, as we say, over time. Half the mangroves in the world have been cleared for production of commodities, for example. And there's a lot of pressure on these ecosystems, and that also means that there's a lot of opportunity to restore them. So, I've been working a lot on restoration recently. I've been working with the Australian government to create a blue carbon method where landholders can get carbon credits for restoring these ecosystems. And I'm really interested in that sort of implementation. We've done a lot of science, and I'm an empirical scientist, but, there's still quite a lot to do to basically to really try and restore a lot of these ecosystems that have been lost in the last century, and salt marshes even earlier than that. So, we're interested in their carbon sequestration, but, why we're really so excited is that these ecosystems provide a whole range of other ecosystem services. And one of them, Pete talked about a lot, biodiversity, but for coastal ecosystems, they provide coastal protection, right? So this is, protection against intense storms, large waves and other things. They protect the communities behind them. So that's got quite a lot of value in many parts of the world. And they're also important for improving water quality. And for the part of the world I come from, where the Great Barrier Reef is at risk, we really need all of those services. And of course, fundamental to most communities in developing countries is the fisheries benefits, right? So these are fish nursery habitats. Without them, you have reduced fish populations, which is reduced nutrition. So for all these reasons, we do blue carbon.
Thanks, Catherine. That was really nice. Would you like to go next, Zhangcai?
Okay, thank you. So my name is Zhangcai. I'm currently a professor at the Sanya University, based in China. So I'm leading a small group studying both energy-based and nature-based climate solutions. So most of them are young scholars and graduate students. They are very passionate about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and lower down the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. So we have been looking at several sectors and also natural systems. For example, for the new renewables, we have looked at bioenergy, BECCS, and I think put them under the combined category, both energy and natural system. And for nature-based systems, we have looked at forest and agriculture. And since I moved here, I'm located currently in a coastal city. We started to look at blue carbon, like mangroves, and like Catherine did. That's where I learned a lot from Catherine's papers and lectures. And so basically for me, I joined the Science University about 3 years ago. Prior to that, I have been studying and work at Purdue University in the US. That's where I got my PhD. And then I worked at the Oregon National Laboratory. That's a national laboratory belonging to the US DOE. I worked there for many years studying bioenergy, BECCS, and also the natural ecosystem modeling. So yeah, that's pretty much for me. I'm delighted to join today's meeting, and I hope we can have a very open and fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Zhangcai. Niki, would you like to go next?
Hi, good morning and good evening, everybody. I'm Niki Frantzeskaki. I'm currently with Utrecht University in the Netherlands. My research has been on nature-based solutions in urban areas, in cities, over the past almost 12 years. And the input I would like to make in the panel is to look closely. I have actually 3 points to make. So to start with is the first point is how to move our evidence base, to systematize it, to gather the information required so as to make better planning and implementation of nature-based solutions at scale in cities. And this statement is rather large, I completely understand, but at the same time shows how tricky implementation is. So is the fact that we are having a mounting evidence about different types of nature-based solutions, from rain gardens, from water-sensitive urban design interventions, from green walls, green roofs, and all these different, you might say, novel ecosystem type 3 nature-based solutions. However, we would like to have more systematization of this evidence. A lot of the evidence now in the scholarship is case-based and very context-embedded. That is very rich and very useful. However, we would like in the next step to have this evidence base more systematized, more international, more cross-case and verified. The second point I would like to make is about looking beyond and bringing back the nature-based solutions. That's another implementation aspect we need to consider. And if we look at the different and prominent definitions of nature-based solutions, is not only about delivering benefits to people and have an anthropocentric focus, but also protecting and creating habitat and contributing to biodiversity. To do this and take this at heart, especially as an implementation challenge and also as implementation opportunity, is to open up the discussion on the multifunctionality of nature-based solutions, to look on more than human species, but also to look on which type of nature components, ecological components we use in nature-based solutions, and how they can contribute to biodiversity in cities in the changing climate. This is also a factor we should not forget. The third aspect I would like again to discuss about implementation is how to be critical on our own knowledge production process. And living in Australia the past 3 years, the big debate there is about how to incorporate Aboriginal knowledge, how to create and establish nature-people connections without neglecting, without shadowing knowledge systems that exist there for generations. Coming back to Europe, this discussion comes and falls into how do you include the voices not represented, how local knowledge, local communities, local innovators can also become more the change agents and co-creators of nature-based solutions. A lot of cities are moving in this direction, but I think we need also a more critical investigation and reflection of how this happens. Thank you.
Thanks, Niki. Carlos, you go.
Oh, I'm a plant ecology professor at the University of Campinas in São Paulo, Brazil. For the last 20 years, we've been working on the Atlantic rainforest. This is a biodiversity hotspot. First phase of the study, we were getting information about the composition and the structure of the forest, then the dynamics and also the nitrogen and carbon cycles, looking if it was a sink or a source of CO2. We concluded that it's a small sink of carbon, and most of this work has been done in protected areas. But for the last 5 years, we've been working on the surroundings of the protected areas, where you have small farmers that have a property, perhaps with 1 or 2 cows, and is doing some subsistence agriculture. And we introduced the restoration of forest surrounding water springs and small water courses, and protecting the existing forest, and started by involving them, the local community in this process, and through the payment for ecosystem services. So the first we calculated in the protection of water sources and the water itself. Then we've managed to add a proportion regarding to the carbon stock that those reforested areas would uptake. And then we developed a biodiversity index that is not only based on the diversity of the trees they are using, but also the value of reestablishing corridors that are reconnecting fragments of the native forest. So through this, we've been enhancing the ecosystem services of the area, but we've also enhancing the living quality of those small farmers. And with this long-term research that we've done, we are starting now a synthesis center for the state of São Paulo. So we are moving from the scale of the forest, of the coastal forest for the whole state. The whole state is about the size of UK. And then moving with the restoration of areas that have been forest in the 18th century. The forest was cut for coffee, and now most of it is planted with sugarcane. And again, using the same system of restoring, starting by protecting the water and carbon, and working together with the State Secretary of Environment. So we are producing knowledge that's been used to improve the legal framework on reforestation in the state. We've been also trying to do this, as Pete said. We have a lot of work done with forests, but we're also trying to do this with the Cerrado. The Cerrado is a savanna-like vegetation in the state of São Paulo, growing from seed germination to early establishment, and the whole development of the trees are completely different from forest. So it's a lot of research that's being done there, and it grows much slower than the forest, although the carbon they stock, mainly below ground carbon stocked, is very significant. So we think that it's worthwhile going for research and learning how to restore this type of vegetation as well.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you all. I think we have a very nice, expertise diversity in the panel, and this is, this is very enriching for the discussion. So maybe I would like to, use this opportunity that you all come from different, contexts around nature-based solutions. Maybe we could start to span a bit more on specific contexts. Some of you have already provided a few hints on this, but what do you feel are the main challenges and opportunities to unleash the potential of nature-based solutions to push them forwards in your specific areas of focus? Maybe we can use the same kind of order if you like. Do you want to start, Catherine?
Yeah, I'll start. There's a lot of barriers to restoring coastal wetlands globally, right? And I suppose when I think about my own country first, I'm not going to talk about other countries, but my own country is really getting landholders on board, right? So, we would like to restore not only coastal wetlands, but other parts of the landscape that are important for water quality, for example, but actually changing those practices of landholders, I think, are really it's a cultural thing. They're almost harder to do than the technical things, right? So I suppose I'm interested in what Carlos might say about that, what lessons he might have to give us from his perspective. I mean, there's a range of other challenges as well. I'd say globally that methods that incentivize that incentivize restoration for carbon are very, very complicated, expensive to implement beyond the scope of small community-based projects. Like there's a whole range of things. And then in those countries, sometimes they don't count the carbon that you might get if you restore, because they don't really implement the greenhouse gas guidance, the greenhouse gas inventory guidance that's provided by the IPCC, because that's a technical challenge. So I think you can think about the challenges on really lots of levels, from the cultural changes to the, on an international scale.
Zhangcai?
Yeah, so I will add to Catherine's points. Actually, I echo what Pete has actually introduced in his talk. I would think that implementation overall is one of the biggest challenges for now. So from my experience looking into like the ecological project that has been actually implemented in China for many decades, I would say for the past half century, that in theory, I think we have a pretty, like the NBS theory is in pretty good shape. But the next step is how we can kind of scale this up, like at a global scale. So if we have to have NBS, like nature-based solutions to actually work, to actually reduce emissions, or to kind of provide a solution to climate change, we have to have a large scale implementation. And we have to act fast, act now. So it's timely, and we have to use proper implementation techniques, measures. And Catherine just also mentioned we have some barriers in the social and economic field. That might also add to like the general implementation kind of challenge there. I will stop here. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Zhangcai. Yeah, very interesting points. Well, what do you think, Niki? What's your perspective on this?
Well, I think we're all pointing to the same challenge, in a way that we are all agreeing that we don't have time to waste and we need to take urgent action. So that's like the more acceleration for implementation challenge. But this comes also with scale consideration. And I can only say my knowledge comes for cities and for the urban environments, that this has been some research, especially on the scaling up of nature-based solutions to be citywide implementation. And what we see as major barrier and challenge there, you might say, is how they play out in existing path-dependent urban development. So financialization, for example, of urban spaces and urban commodities is quite of a driver that creates a lot of inequalities and amplifies inequalities in cities. When NBS are to be scaled and to be rolled out in areas of inequality or in the periphery of these areas, that creates a lot of tensions and a lot of questions. At the same time, the scale up, it means that it needs to create a radical shift. Other technologies and other means need to be deinstitutionalized. So grey infrastructure development needs now to be reconsidered, how it can be hybridized with NBS. This is always a challenge in terms of the skills, the expertise, and the investment in a way you have on other technologies. To add to this, I would say, can we recognize or can we see common tensions or common challenges for NBS mainstreaming in different sectors? I mean, Professor Smith talked a lot about the forestry sector, reforestation. And the same with Professor Joly. So are the common challenges that for implementation that can be identified across different sectors, from coastal restoration all the way to bioenergy, all the way to forestry and to urban, or are very distinct and sector specific? That would be also kind of a question as a response. Thank you.
Thanks, Niki. I know you've already talked about this in your talk, Pete, but would you like to add some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think there are countless examples around the world in the past of where policy has not been quite right, where policy has been put in place to encourage a certain behaviour or encourage certain interventions, which has missed the mark. So I think a critical challenge is implementation, as all the panelists have said so far. It is to do with implementation, but that implementation will only happen if there's appropriate policy in place to encourage the right interventions. And it's so easy to get those interventions wrong. There are lots of examples all over the world of where it's just missed. There's been not a complete understanding of what's needed. And you only have to have the policy a little bit wrong to implement wildly inappropriate measures. So I think really us as scientists communicating with the policymakers who are implementing the policy that's going to make this happen, we have to make sure that we're speaking with them and that we're co-developing those policies with the science and the policymakers to make sure that it's just spot on, so that it incentivizes the right interventions, it makes sure that people are included, and it makes sure that there are measurable benefits to biodiversity as well as carbon offsets.
Very true, very true. What do you think, Carlos? You are muted, Carlos.
One of the big challenges we have is the cost of opportunity. It's much cheaper to do the restoration in these areas where I'm saying that small farmers that are almost surviving with little creation and some agriculture. Then when you come to talk to the guys that are planting sugarcane in very large scales for producing either ethanol or running cars, we use this a lot in Brazil, or for sugar for exploitation. So we have to analyze this, and we need to have a background on the legal framework of the state, and that's what we've managed to get. So these large properties will have to restore part of the area as a legal requirement for them to be certificated. The other major point that we are facing now is that as we started these restoration processes some 20 years ago in different areas in the state, we have forests of different sizes. It's a very diverse forest. You may have 150, 180 species of trees on 1 hectare. This is more than the number of species of trees that you have in Europe. So obviously you cannot put all of them together. So you're restoring certainly the structure, but not all the diversity. And what we are facing now is that you need to reintroduce fauna. If you don't have the small rodents and if you don't have the birds to disperse seeds, this forest will grow, will be nicely there, but they will not work as a forest. They will not have a turnover, a dynamic of a forest, because you don't have this important animals for dispersion. So if you put this all together, the costs start to building up. So we also started to try to use things from areas that are naturally restoring, so just let them alone and they will go on, to areas where they are restoring, but we introduce some of the trees that are not there. To the other end, where we had a pasture for 50 years, the topsoil has been gone, and you have really to replant from seedlings. That's the most expensive thing. So if you put all together, there are different challenges that go from the legal to the cost of it, and to be sure that the forest is going to have its own dynamics.
Thanks so much. So I think you all agree probably that implementation is the critical point, and I see that you all are interested in this part of the discussion. So maybe I was interested in this thing you were saying, Pete, about the policy science interface. I think that's important. How do you feel the policy science interface for nature-based solutions look at this stage, and what do you feel are the main policy lacks to achieve a successful implementation of nature-based solutions?
Well, I think that really depends upon the country. I'm in Scotland, which is a relatively small country, and here we have a clear line of sight between the scientists and the policymakers. As you mentioned in my introduction, I'm the science director of Climate Exchange, which is a centre of expertise on climate change. And our role in Climate Exchange is to put together evidence for the policymakers. We co-deliver those questions that need to be asked with the policymakers, and we provide evidence on that basis, not doing original research, but synthesising research and just synthesising what's already known to present it to the policymakers so that they can make the best decisions possible. But that's not always possible. The bigger the country, the more layers of bureaucracy there are in between the scientists doing the work and the people who make the decisions. So I think to a certain extent, it's easier in smaller countries. It's easier for them to develop those mechanisms. In larger countries, if I look at the UK government, for example, Scotland's part of the UK. The UK is much bigger, and there's much more layers of bureaucracy in between the people doing the science and the policymakers. So I think if you ask every member of the panel their experience from their own country, you'll find that it will be different. But I think that the main point is that it can't just be the scientists writing a paper and expecting that that's going to be, the politicians are going to read it, or the policymakers are going to read it and understand it and implement it. It needs much more work on behalf of the scientists to distill that knowledge and to get it into a form that can be used by policymakers. And it's up to us as scientists to do that, to help the policymakers. But it's also up to the policymakers to request and to co-develop that information with the scientists. So I think that's really important, and that's an interface that we need to grow, not only in nature-based solutions, but in all evidence-based policy making. We've been doing evidence-based medicine for hundreds of years, so why aren't we doing evidence-based policy more? We really should.
Yeah, I think you make an interesting point that everyone probably in the panel has a different view from their own countries and these. So maybe we can do a round and see what people think about. Do you want to start, Catherine?
I just actually wanted to reflect on something that Carlos said and then something that Pete said, and that Carlos said that he said that regulation was important as well as policy, and I think that's really, governments sometimes are very, reticent to regulate, and yet in many cases that's appropriate, even though it's more difficult. And so one of the things that Niki said was that, are there sector-specific issues? And for coastal wetlands, because they're on the edge of the land and sea, we have this sort of sector-specific issue of land tenure, which is sometimes exceedingly unclear. And with sea level rise, there's even less clarity about where you call the edge of the land versus, what's in the sea and who owns it, And so, that there are some fixes there that actually might, in I mean, and that varies not only nation to nation, state to state within nations, right? So it can be very unclear, but in some cases, regulation might be the way to solve that problem. For example, we should have a standard, interpretation of what is going to happen to the land as sea level rises. And this comes back to planning and other things. But basically, with sea level rising, there's an opportunity to, and particularly if agriculture is degraded, to replace them with coastal wetlands that can do carbon sequestration and provide other sorts of services. But I think there's sometimes there's some real blurry sort of legal regions in there.
Yeah, you're totally right. How do you see things from China, Zhangcai? What do you have to say about this?
Yes, actually, I agree with Pete, Carlos, and Catherine that we are actually kind of in a state that the physical scientists, like most of us are very confident about some of the the MDS solutions. But I think the next step is to kind of work with social scientists, economists, and policymakers to actually make this work. So just from my personal experience and studies about the China's kind of ecological projects during the past half century. So China has initiated tens, I think over 20 ecological projects. So initially they were not actually designed for natural climate solution or nature-based solution. There was not, 50 years ago, there was no such word at that time. So those projects including reforestation, afforestation, and also grassland reduce grazing, and for coast protection and prevention of the deforestation. So all of that has been launched during the past 50 years. So I think I have a number. So there was a paper I just read about it's a kind of a summarizing the programs. It's called Land System Sustainability Programs. It's actually summarized by Brad Bryan from Australia, summarizing the programs in China. So they have a figure showing that in China, there have been about 600 million hectares of land being involved in these different type of programs. 600 million hectares, that's about 2/3 of the total land in China. And China is big, pretty big. And those programs, they have been designed to kind of protect soil, protect land from degradation, from desertification. And because in the northwest China, there has been very severe kind of wind erosion and the soil degradation 50 years ago. So there have been many programs for that. So, but when we kind of look back at those programs in terms of the climate change mitigation, we found that some of the programs, they actually have pretty good benefits for carbon sequestration, for both biomass carbon accumulation and soil carbon sequestration. So what I want to say that for policy making, well, in China, there has been a central government-driven policy because there has been a lot of investment in China to those projects. So I summarized that the policy making system in China kind of as top-down and bottom-up. What I mean by top-down is that the central government, they have the kind of a general idea or the governance administration of those projects. So initiated or launched those projects, and they kind of invest in these projects. Then the local government and the stakeholders, they take this forward, right? They grow trees or reduce fertilizer use, whatever they do. And then there is a bottom-up, I call it bottom-up approach. So it's kind of a report system. So like the stakeholders or even the farmers, they can kind of feedback to the local government, then back to the central government. And what scientists do were both physics scientists or social scientists, what they do, they kind of involved in those processes. They are providing guidance or providing even questions to the government, like how we can do this better. Because China has been doing this for 50 years, there has been a lot of experience there. Yeah, I think that's something I can share with you. And I'm not an expert in policy making, but I think this is kind of example to show how scientists, policymakers, they can work together.
Yeah, you make a very interesting point, and we probably can discuss a bit more later on. But let's finish this round, giving the word to Niki and then Carol.
Well, I have to say that most of my work has been on how to understand, but also how to organize these policy science communities, the interfaces, and they're very important. Of course, very challenging in terms of bridging different sectoral aspects, sectoral divides, and creating a common understanding narrative. I want to say in this, there's a number of pitfalls. And one of the pitfalls is to say, social scientists is going to solve this. Just put the social scientists there, they speak the language, they're going to fix it. Yeah, let me tell you, that's not going to work. Because we do, let's put it very bluntly out there. That's not going to work for a very simple reason, not because of lack of skill capacity, but because in order to inform policy and to create a very productive policy science community interface, you need to have interdisciplinarity present. So you don't need only the political scientists and the policy scientists and social scientists, you also need people who bridge to ecology, to environmental sciences, to forestry. So it's not that the moment there is a dialogue with policymakers, we just put the social scientists and humanities to deal with it. We need a solid inter and transdisciplinary knowledge base and collaboration for this to work. My second message is all this interface and dialogues, they require time. And then it comes this kind of balance, but at the same time, tension between we need to have this message out fast. We need to create this sense of urgency, and we need to push for a change or for creation of new policy frameworks. But at the same time, you require this trust building and rapport making process to take off. So these policy cycles with the science cycles are not at sync. And we have elaborated on that on earlier publications, that we do need these intermediary organizations to play this role in kind of bridging these two cycles. And Professor Smith earlier exactly explicated this, that this synthesis, this translation of knowledge is very important. So these are the two tensions. Don't leave it only to social sciences and humanities to bridge this gap. We need a more inter and transdisciplinary knowledge base and configuration for this dialogue to happen. And the second thing is this sense of urgency versus creating and building trust that requires time, and the importance of intermediary organizations in this interface. Thank you.
Thanks, Niki. What's your angle on this, Carlos?
Well, exactly to help on solving this problem of the interface, we established a Brazilian platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. This platform is not linked to the government. It's an independent body of researchers. We started to work in 2015. We produced reports based on the same structure and the same framework as the IPBES has been using. And unfortunately, we finished our first round of reports, one on pollination, one on restoration, and one on water, when we had a change in government. And I don't need to go into detail what's the federal Brazilian government position in terms of environment. So all the people that we were in contact, that we were negotiating, and Niki is absolutely correct. There is a time for research, but the political timing is completely different. And you have to consider that there are going to be changes. Some are going to be helpful, some others are not going to be so helpful. So we are not working with the federal government, although we still work with the technicians on the ministries, because the technicians are permanent and are technical and are very good. And we are preparing things for when you have a better situation in the government as a whole to use that. But on the other hand, we've managed to work with the state governments, like the government in the state of São Paulo. And we've been trying to do this, as has been said. You need time to build trust. And again, this is not up to the politicians, but up to the technicians that are working there, that then can convince the politicians that are in charge. We've been having a very good relation with the state government. But then you come to a critical point that is on all the discussions on the Convention on Biological Diversity meetings that ended yesterday, that who is going to pay for that? Where is the money coming from? If that's it's expensive, who will produce, and how much do we need? My position is that obviously we need international funds, but you also need the private sector to come with part of the money. And there are a lot of large industry groups that are really wanting to help. It's not a greenwashing, and Pete was very accurate when he said we have to take a lot of care that it's just not greenwashing. But I think they should be called also to have to pay for the bill to restore forest. But restoration, if everything works very, very well, it's perhaps solving 30% of the problems of emissions. We need to have this organized with other policies that also will help, like Catherine has said, the coastal areas. And we, by the way, Catherine, one of the reports that we are producing is focused on coastal and marine areas. These are very important from livelihoods, and it's very important also for carbon and biodiversity. So we need to bring more to this, different techniques of agriculture that keeps carbon on the soil. We have to use all this array of techniques to really give a significant contribution in terms of CO2 emissions.
Thank you, Carlos. I think you are making very, very interesting points about the importance of stakeholder interaction, and I would like to dig a bit more on this. Well, what do you feel is the role of indigenous and local knowledge in the upscaling of nature-based solutions? And Niki was already talking a little bit about tensions. What tensions are expected to arise in this, interaction between stakeholders, and how do you feel we can manage them, particularly to ensure an equal, just, and successful outcome of nature-based solutions initiatives? Do you want to start, Catherine?
Yeah, Niki already alluded to the importance of the Indigenous people in Australia to land management. I mean, we've had a huge catastrophe with fires recently, and I think that's really brought to the fore the importance of Indigenous knowledge of the landscape. Mostly, I'm involved in this project that's like trying to build a restoration roadmap for Australia, particularly in marine coastal. And one of the things that came out of that is that Indigenous people feel that they are not respected, right? So it's pretty fundamental, really, how you the importance of engaging with people and the importance of listening, right? But, that is often happens on a very white person's timeline, which is, would you answer that email tomorrow, please? And many Indigenous communities have trouble with those sorts of timelines for various reasons. And so here we have this tension where, even though some people have the best of intentions, and I've fallen into this trap as well, that the time frame that we're demanding things happen on is actually unrealistic for the Indigenous community. So, there has to be a lot more respect, really. I mean, fundamentally. I think also, when I think about the blue carbon method, so this is a method for our voluntary market that we've made to incentivise restoration. And I think the federal government was encouraged to make it by pressure largely brought to bear by industry and by those private sector peeps, not only, state governments and, NGOs, but really the private sector was pushing for it because, Australia is largely a big landmass, and we actually have relatively fewer, coastal ecosystems compared to our savannas, for example, which are massive, right? But so even though it was small, the pressure was brought to bear to make this blue carbon method, which is now, available, and we hope there's going to be projects. So I really think that, everybody getting engaged. I also reflect on what Pete said. Australia is a pretty small population, and so the scientists are actually pretty close to government. We don't have something that's quite as organised as what Pete's got there, but we're actually very engaged often, in the process. So that's good, but it's on us also to listen to those Indigenous people's voices and what they want. So this first blue carbon method is about tidal introduction, and it's about, it's for people who have land where the tides have been removed to grow agricultural crops, for example, and now you can open the floodgates and let the coastal wetlands re-establish for a carbon credit, right? But who doesn't have that kind of land? Aboriginal people don't have that kind of land because that's the land that's been taken, right? So, then this blue carbon method doesn't really suit Aboriginal people, and we're going to need to make something else, And I think you got to have this is when it's really important to keep your eyes on the fairness part and let that sort of guide where you're going to, what actions you might take. So, for now.
Thanks, Catherine. Do you want to provide some insights on that, Zhangcai?
I will add a little bit to that. So we can expect extensions from all levels, I would say, from local even to the different sites or government, stakeholders, and even farmers. So I think this probably comes to the question is who or how we can kind of ease this tension. So basically, how to motivate the different levels of people or government to actually move forward. So, for example, for the farmers, how we can motivate them to apply conservation agriculture, which I think is part of NBS. So either we can give them credit, or, for example, to penalize if they don't do this. So an example from my past experience when I worked with corn growers in the US and also with the government. So the government, like in the US, the government, for example, the California government, they kind of credit the ethanol produced from corn. But they are trying to figure out how they can give more credit to farmers or corn growers who have applied the best management practice. For example, cover crop or reduce the tillage. So how, if they have protected their land, they're gonna give more credit. So how they can talk to each other, like as the government and the farmers. The farmers, they want to get more credit for that. So this is where we as a scientist kind of step in to kind of collect the communication there, to kind of build a dialogue between them. So this is, I believe, there is still ongoing work in the government, the California government. They're trying to figure out like how they can give the right credit to the right people. That's kind of there has been tension between the government and the corn growers, but this is kind of the way they are trying to figure it out. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Zhangcai. Niki?
I have to say, I agree with what Catherine already said, that it is important to always reflect from which ground you're starting this dialogue with Aboriginal or local people. And it is indeed a criticism received that is the projectification, of all these initiatives that are being done always from, a power position of scientists and policymakers. And there is a tokenistic approach or an extractive knowledge approach to this. So these are like the signposts of what we need to avoid, and we need a better practice on that. I have to say that there are examples and cases and settings and practices already in place of how we can take a more open, pluralistic, decolonial approach to this. So this is already happening, but of course, we need to build more knowledge on that. And we need to systematize also the more transdisciplinary approaches to this, to talk about a more equal footing or even a foregrounding of Aboriginal communities, and at the same time, an appreciation of the local knowledge. And I know this is not only in locations and in places that Indigenous communities exist, and you need to, of course, take into consideration history, but also with local knowledge systems. And I have to say that there is where you need exactly this more interdisciplinary understanding. Maybe being a policy scientist or an environmental scientist might not be enough. You need different also methods, approaches from communication science, even from journalism, of how to approach and create these interfaces. So I will put the message out that for this to happen, and for this to happen in the right way, I think we need to be agile, to be adaptive, and also to invite different disciplines to help us in this interface. We cannot always find the solutions ourselves.
That's very true. I very much agree with that. What insights can you provide on this, Pete?
Well, not as many insights as Niki and Catherine, obviously, because this is much more their area. But I think what we could do on a practical point of view, when we can ask project developers to consider environmental justice as one of the key components when we assess a project. So we already asked project developers to have baseline, have mechanisms to measure soil carbon change or vegetation carbon change, biodiversity. We should also require project developers to demonstrate that they've included Indigenous and local communities in the development of the project, to demonstrate that they've engaged, demonstrate that they have representation, in the project planning and the project implementation. That's one thing that we could do, rather than just relying on the scientific measures. We should also be scoring those characteristics of a project. Is it suitable? We can just build those in and say you must do this.
Yeah, totally agree. Carlos, you probably work with local communities quite a lot. So what have you seen? What have you experienced?
Yeah, one of the reports that we produced through the Brazilian platform is a contribution of indigenous and local ecology to biodiversity and ecosystem services. This was led by an anthropologist and by a knowledge holder, so that we were seeing this as that we should not try to say that one way of knowledge or one school of knowledge is better than the other. We have the scientific knowledge, it's recognized and it's evaluated by peers when you are publishing, but the traditional knowledge has been evaluated through generation. It's completely different system. There is no better or worse knowledge. We are trying to put them together to work, and it's been a very, very interesting experience. It's not my own project, but the project that is being developed in the Amazon region, in the region of Rio Negro, where you have a diversity of indigenous groups that are occupying the land and have a very large reserve. And we are following what's happening there, and it's amazing the amount of knowledge this group that's working there. They just published a taxonomy of macrofungi based on the traditional knowledge that is basically separated in the ones that are edible, the ones that are used for some kind of religious ceremony, the ones that are taboo, that are for some reasons, and you look at that, and you can see that this is very well organized. So there's a lot of knowledge behind that. So I must say that as a biologist by formation, I'm learning with this process on getting engaged with local knowledge and learning also how to respect and how to use that knowledge for better solutions. But it's a process, and I think that this takes time. As we said before, we have to develop trust in each other. But I think it's a valuable way of looking to the future and finding common solutions.
Very true. Very much agree with that. I wanted some of you have highlighted this in one of your responses, but I wanted to shift from the interaction or kind of governance factors limiting implementation to a tricky one, I guess, right? Because money is always like a very limiting factor, and that's going to determine what we can do or what we can prioritize. So I'd like to know your thoughts on whether you feel the funding needs to come from, and since money is limited and opportunity is costly, what actions or places or ecosystem functions do you feel we need to prioritize through nature-based solutions initiatives? Catherine?
Places, and for Queensland, where I come from, I think there's an absolute imperative to deal with water quality, and so I think restoration of the riparian regions, the creeks, the rivers, the wetlands of Queensland are should have the highest priority. The government already spends an extraordinary amount of money in that region, and I feel like it could be more effectively deployed, right? So that's one, if I just had that's the visceral response for my area of the world. I think I also do a project in Myanmar, and I would say those coastal mangroves in the delta should be extremely high priority before the next huge cyclone comes and kills hundreds of thousands of people. right? So there's just places like that I think it's a no-brainer, we should act, you know. But you raise an interesting point about who's going to pay. So I think, you know, in some cases, it's within the remit of our governments, because basically they're going to pay in another way if they don't pay in, you know, for restoration. You know, like in the end, it's going to come back to bite you, and then you might be paying even more, you know, for the cleanup of what occurs, and the moral, you know, but basically there's a moral obligation, I think, in many cases. But you know, the market is another way. Not everything can be done through the market. Some people think that the market is the be all and end all, and I don't agree. You know, like it's useful, but it's only one of the ways where you can generate money, you know, finance to do projects. So, I mean, for blue carbon projects, I must say a lot of the early work has come through philanthropy, which is essentially the private sector, and they've been really, really important in getting pilot projects off the ground. So, and mostly at the moment, I think the priority for a lot of people is doing blue carbon projects where you can. Because, you know, even though we say there's a lot of opportunity for restoration, actually finding the locations and the right kind of scale is really quite, is proving very difficult.
Zhangcai, what are your feelings about this?
Okay, this is challenging. So, like Catherine said, we cannot rely on market for everything. Especially true for NBS. So what I mean by that, so NBS, as Peter also mentioned, that it's going to be at a very large scale, especially for global scale. And we want to act fast and act immediately. So that means we need a lot of money. A lot, I mean, billions of dollars. So like for China, a rough number for the past 50 years for the projects they have launched, they have spent billions, well, tens of billions. There's a number for the, I think it's 8 years ago. Each year, there's an investment about $40 billion US. I don't think that's something we can rely on the private sectors. So for those large scale projects, I think most of the money might still be coming from the government. But eventually, I think the government got the money from the tax, and then the tax comes from people who live on Earth. So, yeah, so the investment, I would think, most from the government, at least for now. Unless we have a really mature market and people can just buy carbon from the market. Yeah, thank you.
Niki.
Well, I have to say I agree with exactly what Catherine said. But at the same time, I find that we need a strategic agenda here of which are the areas or the projects or the issues that we rely on government funding and that cannot be left for other type of investments or other type of fundings. But at the same time, especially some large corporations, they are looking on offsetting their carbon. They're looking for opportunities to invest back in nature. And we should not, we should not avoid having this difficult discussion. But at the same time, I find that it should not come at an opportunity base, but more with a strategic agenda. So there is where I would say that in order to balance the private interest with the interest of the people that the government is there to represent and care for, we need this strategic planning to come and guide where money comes from and which project receives which type of funding. In large infrastructure projects, and that's not for nature, but for a lot of other sectors, you see all this experience being done on public-private partnerships So this should also be an option and an avenue to be explored. But again, with a strategy, with a plan, with a specific also social filtering on that. And I think the governments are there for this reason. So I'm a little bit against to say the citizens have to pay directly or indirectly. I think we need to have a stronger government, stronger environmental policy and planning exactly for these reasons. Thank you.
That sounds really sensible. What's your angle on this, Pete?
Yeah, I think maybe some sort of blended finance would be possible, using government money to maybe de-risk a little bit some of the money that could come in from the private sector. So using the government money to de-risk and underwrite the risk associated with private investments, that could unlock huge amounts of potential money in the private sector to invest in nature-based solutions. So I'm not an expert on this, but just listening from people who do know more about it than I do, this seems to be one way in which you could ensure that there's adequate regulation, to ensure some government oversight, but to allow private finance to be brought in. There's a huge amount of private finance out there, trillions of dollars, which far outstrip the good quality projects that are on the ground. So I think there's a massive potential to develop projects to access this finance, but we need to just make sure that this is done with some government oversight, some regulation, to avoid the greenwashing that's all too prevalent. But if it's managed carefully, it could be done, I think, to bring trillions of dollars potentially into this space to enable nature-based solutions to really take off and be upscaled.
Hopefully. I really hope so. Carlos, what do you think?
Well, as been said before, I think that it's a multi-source funds that should come apart from the government, apart from the private sector, apart from the international funds that are being created or being established, like the GEF or yesterday on the closing of the Geneva meetings, 63 developing countries proposed establishment of a new fund of $100 billion for this year and another equal budgets for the subsequent years. But I also think that money can come from ending subsidies that are going in the wrong direction, subsidies that are keeping coal, that are keeping oil, that are keeping a lot of activities that are throwing an enormous amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, and you perhaps need positive subsidies. Like, for instance, we have a situation here in Brazil where a landowner that has a nice piece of native forest in his property, he can transform that in a reserve. It's a private reserve, but with that, he's not going to pay taxes on that land. But I will go further. I will say, if he wants to have a small hotel that uses the reserve as an attraction, people can go for trails, can go for things. This activity should be subsidized on opening an economical way of survival, a small hotel, or whatever. So I think we have to sit together with people that, with economists that can help planning, looking at what we have today and see where you can shift money that's already being used for other purposes with activities that will enhance nature-based solutions. And I think it might work if we use the right set of tools to do it. And I agree, because we had a lot of this in Brazil. So I'm with Pete that we must always be looking for greenwashing, because sometimes you think that it's very sound, it's beautiful, but in the end is nothing more than a way of showing or using this for propaganda and not really a commitment of the group. But I think we are progressing in that direction of using different sources.
I like to hear that optimistic message to to end the round. That's very critical, I think. Well, I think we could be discussing about implementation angles for hours. I see that time is running out, and I would like to focus a little bit on the decarbonization, particularly, which is meant to be the focus of this session. And let's say that we get to implement things appropriately, as Pete was saying in his talk. How much do you think we can rely on nature-based solutions for decarbonization? What do you think is the share they have for meeting net zero targets, and linking a little bit with the session that we'll be having tomorrow? What do you think are the opportunities of synergizing them with other carbon capture solutions? Catherine?
I mean, I'm going to just talk about blue carbon here, in that the proportion of emissions that can be taken care of by blue carbon projects, even the most optimistic scenarios, is quite low, on a global scale. But then it just depends on what nation you're sitting in as to what the opportunity is, right? So if you're in Bangladesh or Indonesia, you actually have quite a lot of opportunity, or Myanmar, because your emissions in other sectors are quite low and you've got a lot of that kind of land. So I think on a national, it sort of varies on a national scale, and then probably even on smaller scales. So, but globally, blue carbon is not going to save us, right? And I think other parts of the land sector have a greater role to play. But, we talked about co-benefits, and I would argue that's one of the reasons why blue carbon should have a very high priority, is the benefits that coastal people get from their ecosystems.
Zhangcai?
Okay, that's actually a very tough question for me. So I would base my points on an earlier paper, actually we published last year with Pete and also Gracecom. So Pete also introduced that paper about the NBS overall emissions reduction size. It's about 23 petograms CO2 per year. That's probably about half of the current annual emissions. That's a lot. And that land that we share would be about 50%. But that's kind of a theoretic maximum potential from nature. If we roll in, let's say, the money, the economic effective size of the potential, they're going to be cutting to half of that. So still we have about 25% share of emissions reduction from nature. Later on, we did a little bit calculation about how the actions, like our action to delay the nature-based solutions. So basically saying, if the countries, they are not doing anything at this point, they're still doing whatever they want, like based on their current policy, then that potential from NBS going to be further cut down, like a half. So that's going to leave us about 10% of that share from nature. So that share really depends a lot on what we do next. Even for, let's say, for forest, even we grow forest like just overnight, it still takes several years for the forest to actually to have a measurable carbon sequestration. So we don't really have a lot of luxury to kind of compete with time. So I don't think I have a really certain answer to that here. I don't know if I made myself clear though.
Yeah, I mean, it's intendedly a tough question, but I mean, you can probably have a better idea that we do, you know, in the audience.
Yeah.
What do you think about this, Niki?
Well, I think that the co-benefits angle is definitely one to take on looking at co-benefits NBS are producing on this. But at the same time, it should not become an excuse that the investment and the scale up of NBS do not take action in other sectors. So I find that we need to see it in a more like integrative way. So we need to push that investment and scaling up and strengthening of NBS should come hand in hand with looking of how you decarbonize other sectors as well. Mobility, energy, food production, housing, lifestyles. So we need to look at it across. Otherwise, it's going to be, an instrument of greenwashing that, okay, we invest in nature-based solutions, but at the same time we extract coal or continue investing on fossil fuel industries. So that should not become, like the excuse for inaction in other sectors. That would be my message.
Very nice. Pete?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that at best, nature-based solutions could maybe make the land-based sector carbon neutral. We could maybe all the residual non-CO2 emissions from agriculture, we could maybe use the land and ocean-based solutions to make the land and the ocean carbon neutral. But I don't think we could use it to offset emissions from other sectors. So when people are talking about using it to offset aviation or to offset transport or continued use of fossil fuels, I think that's fantasy, and it will lead us down the wrong path. So we have to plan A, and plan A should be the only plan really, should be to reduce emissions immediately and aggressively in all sectors of the economy. And then we can just use these nature-based solutions maybe to mop up what's left of the non-CO2 emissions in the land sector to give us a carbon neutral land sector. But it can't be really used for much else.
That's very enlightening. Carlos?
Well, if we consider the Brazilian commitment to the Paris Agreement, it's to increase the amount of clean energy being used in the country, to use more wind and solar, to reduce deforestation, and to reforest 12 million hectares. This way, Brazil would reach the reduction in emissions that's needed. It says nothing about the emission of the industrial sector. It says nothing about transport. And as the previous panelist said, that's not possible. I mean, all sectors must adjust to their emissions. To have it mainly based in reducing deforestation and reforested an enormous area will not be enough to really give a contribution to the world. So there was a change in our policy earlier this year. It's been even weakened in terms of there's no control of the areas that are being restored. There is no monitoring. We don't know where it's happening and who is doing it. So I think that we are not going the way that is going with this government. We are not going to meet the national target, and we surely are not going to help reaching the target that's been on the agreement. I really hope that with a change in the federal government, we start to have regulations for the other sectors so that a reduction will happen throughout the sectors without hampering the economic development. It's a developing country has different situations than Australia or UK or the Netherlands, but you cannot go on just emitting carbon without looking at all the sectors.
Good. So I see that we are running out of time. It's a pity because I'm enjoying this so much. I'd like to give you the opportunity to give the audience, a take-home message before leaving. So perhaps could you use a couple of minutes to deliver this take-home message and maybe give the impression of what you feel is the path forward and what are the main immediate needs in terms of research, action, implementation, whatever you feel you want to say to the audience. Kath?
I always get to go first. So. What I would say is that I really we just discussed the potential for decarbonisation, and I'm saying that coastal wetlands have a limited role to play. But so I would reiterate it's limited, but really, really important for the co-benefits. And fisheries, water quality, and probably one we haven't talked about is climate change. So these ecosystems are vulnerable to climate change, sea level rise, fluctuating, sea levels, temperature, marine heat waves for seagrass. So often that seems to be a disincentive for people to take on protection and restoration. But really, what we need is just climate smart protection and restoration. And I think we've talked a lot about restoration. I did talk a lot about restoration, and I suppose I want to say that protection is actually probably much, in terms of decarbonising, it is the main game, because it's those emissions from land use change that are really problematic. So I think, it was countries committed to it at the COP, which is to cease deforestation. And for coastal wetlands, I think that is so important. We've got to hold on to what we have and then, work hard to regain, those ecosystems in the landscape for the benefits that they provide. So I suppose I would say all hands on deck at this stage. So whether you're working on boreal forests or seagrasses, I think all of those ecosystems are important and really, we need everybody's effort to get there.
Thank you so much. Zhangcai.
Okay, thank you. So I think there are a lot of young scientists and students in the audience. So I have about 2 points to make. So the first is NBS is very important, not only because it reduces CO2 emissions, but as Catherine emphasized, it has many co-benefits to ecosystem service or environment impact. And then the second point is that NBS is, I call it last mile to carbon neutrality. That's what I keep telling my students, because like Pete has emphasized that NBS is not there to offset emissions from other sectors. Still, like the energy sectors and the industry processes, they have been playing a major role in emissions in the emissions. So they should play a major role in the emissions reduction. That's the first thing. Then for NBS, they can only step in as the last, the goalkeeper. Let's say the energy sectors and the industry processes, they have been reducing emissions a lot, and they have only left like the residual emissions or hard to abate emissions. At that point, nature helps to kind of deliver the last mile package. That's my message. Thank you.
Thank you. What's yours, Niki?
I want to add, because I think Catherine said a lot of the things I want to say, but I will re-say what the IBES chair said back in 2019, that science has a major role to play in transformative change that is needed. So I will add to this that we need to have the science policy and communities partnership to be strengthened so as to bring NBS to the future and to mainstream it across sectors. And that is very important. It needs to come with a science evidence, but we also need stronger environmental policy and planning, and we need the commitment to remain and be maintained. So that's my strong and my takeaway home message to add to the mix. Thank you.
Thanks, Niki. Pete?
Yeah, so we need to tackle the biodiversity crisis and we need to tackle the climate change problem. So nature-based solutions are a great way to address those two things together, particularly because they provide so many co-benefits. So it really is a no-brainer. We really should be doing them, but we shouldn't over-rely on them as a climate change mitigation measure. We have to, as Zhangcai said, we have to reduce emissions aggressively and immediately in all sectors of the economy.
Thanks so much, Pete. What's your message for the audience, Carlos?
I think Catherine brought up one of the most important points, that conservation is much, much better than any restoration that we can do. First, because we cannot restore all the species. Usually we are talking about replanting forests, we are talking about replanting trees, but we are not talking about the epiphytes, we are not talking about the other life forms. And as I said, there's a problem of reintroduction fauna. So if you conserve, if you preserve an area, it's much cheaper and it's much more effective. But the other way, if it has not been preserved, I think that nature-based solution restoration is something that is worthwhile, that is really important in terms of carbon uptake, and it has many lateral benefits, not only for climate and biodiversity, but it also generates jobs. It's a chain that will generate jobs for people that are you don't need to be highly qualified in school to be trained to use and to restore areas and monitor this restoring something that can produce jobs for the ones that are more needing jobs. So I think it's got also this social effect, this benefit that is really worthwhile. So it's we need to improve our connections with the politicians. We need to develop further knowledge in terms of restoration, but it is a very useful tool, and I think we should go to this path. It's a pity that some countries, and Mai is one of these countries, do not accept this language in discussions related to biodiversity. They do accept it in the climate discussions, but they do not accept nature-based solutions in the biodiversity discussions. There must be some reason behind that I really cannot understand. But it's something that is worthwhile applying and going for.
Okay, I hope that these countries will reconsider their position and will realize of the
We are
potential.
working on that.
Hopefully. Well, with those final remarks, I'd like to bring the panel to a close. Many thanks once more, Pete, Catherine, Zhangcai, Niki, and Carlos for participating in this panel and providing such an insightful discussion. I want to, I said this already before the meeting, but I want to say it again to the audience. Thanks, Carlos, for joining us at this time. I know it's a really bad timing for you. Should be like something like 5:30 a.m. now when we are finishing. So thanks a lot for that. And thanks for the opportunity of moderating this panel and you know, for talking with you. I hope to have the opportunity to speak with all of you again in the future. And well, with this, with the end of this panel discussion, we close in today's sessions. Thanks again for joining us today, and I hope you'll decide to join us tomorrow for the second discussion panel on offsetting residual emissions about negative emission technologies. Bye everyone for now.